All right, we're going to get going. So welcome everyone. The subject of this webinar is learning in the flow of work. My name is Carolyn Brant. I'm a global learning strategist at Go1. My bio is basically that I've been in learning and development for 25 years. My personalized learning experience started by crawling around on a floor with stacks of slides, trying to put them into different groups and binders to make a personalized course. So I'm happy to see technology has evolved since then. So, learning in the flow of work has been a hot topic. The question for L&D really is, how do we enable positive learning outcomes quickly and easily at the point of need without switching applications or disrupting the rhythm of productivity? As the workflow changes with new technology, new business practices, and the occasional global pandemic, learning must keep pace. Learning in the flow of work isn't a destination we'll reach, but more a compass to help us continuously change course. So at Go1, we're working closely with our incredible technology partners, for which we have some representatives here today, like the Bersin Academy, customers like Delta Airlines, and also Microsoft. And we're excited to show you about an integration with Microsoft Search, which we just introduced last week. So the panel, I'm going to let everyone introduce themselves, but I want to cover just a little bit of housekeeping. If you have questions, please use the Q&A button and submit them. And we'll try to make time at the end, but you can submit them anytime. I'll get to them as I can. We also have a chat, so if you are really feeling what we're talking about, we'd love to hear from you. I'll try to keep an eye as we go through, but we have a lot to get to. Also, everyone who's attending this will get an email to a link with the recording to this session. So, all housekeeping aside, let's get going. So, Josh, I'd love it if you could introduce yourself.
Sure. My name is Josh Bersin. I'm an industry analyst and have been working in L&D since around 1998, pre-e-learning days when we didn't know what to call it. I think we called it learning on demand at the time. And I'm also now a provider of learning, so I've learned even more about learning because we have an academy of learning for you guys as HR people and as learning people. So I've been, concerned and trying to figure out learning in the flow of work for quite a while, and very excited to be able to work with Go1 on the whole initiative and also explaining it to people as best we can.
Awesome. How about you, Brandon?
Oh, thanks for having me, Carolyn. Appreciate being here. So I'm Brandon Carson, and like Josh, I've been in this industry since pre-internet, the Procrustean age or whatever, back to laser disc training, what we used to do a lot of. But currently I'm with Delta Airlines, and I lead a team that supports all of our operations in the airports across the world and the more than 350 that we operate in. And of course, learning in the flow of work is something we do a lot of in the airline industry.
Okay, and last up, Jane.
Great, thank you. Yes, my name is Jane Horgan. I'm a learning experience designer at Microsoft, and I have not been in the field as long, but I feel like I have. The last 6 years, it's been full of a lot of lessons and learning. And learning the flow of work is something at Microsoft we're trying to tackle. We'll get into that a little more, but we have all these tools. So how do we make sure we're learning with the tools as well as working? So I'm excited to be here.
Awesome. Well, I very much appreciate that you're all here with me today. So Josh, I'm going to throw the first question at you. Mm-hmm. Learning the flow of work is one of your signature topics. It's had a lot of attention in the online corporate education space. For some, it has potentially become a bit of a buzzword. Yeah. So for those who might be new or confused by the concept, can you talk a little bit about what it means?
Yeah, the concept I think is pretty clear, but you have to sort of put it into context. When I first started talking about it, it was more of a vision of how to pull together many of the technology solutions companies were building, which were micro-learning videos, learning experience platforms, highly credentialized end-to-end learning programs, collaborative learning, and so forth. And the question I was trying to answer was, if I'm a learning manager or a training manager, an HR person, where do I put all this stuff so that people can use it at the right point in time? And so I basically drew a picture, a lot of you have probably seen this, of the learning curve of every employee in every job, which is steep in the beginning, plateauing, going down, coming back up, and tried to explain that it seemed to me at the time that we needed to try to find different learning solutions for different parts of the curve. Now, the problem is the curve is always, you're always on the curve. You know, you're on the steep part of the curve in one thing, and then you're on the shallow part of the curve in something else, and then that thing suddenly you go on the steep part of the curve again. So what we have to do is, as learning designers and learning and development professionals, is look at the audience we're trying to reach, and then sort of look at this curve relative to their role, and then design the learning interventions to fit into these different parts of the curve. In the early days of a program, of a job, you need a lot of very structured learning. And then, you know, once you've been doing the job for a while, you need a lot of unstructured learning. And then later, when you get promoted or you get a new assignment, you need structured learning again. And I think the confusion of this is that the vendors have all grabbed the phrase and said, my AI does learning in the flow of work. And it's not that simple. I mean, so I think what I'd love to talk about today is what Brandon's doing and what Jane's doing and where this fits, because I think it's an architectural solution that's going to vary in different companies in different ways. Then there are companies I know, for example, that are tracking minute by minute activities of people on the phone. And when they get a break, learning pops up. So that's like almost the most stark version of it, but a lot of people obviously aren't in that situation. So that's a little bit of a context for it. Oh, one more thing I'll just say, just as an intro. The other reason it's so important, as you guys know, is we're also doggone busy with our computers and our tools and our videos and our phones, that if it isn't in the flow of work, we may not get to it. So to some degree, this is a mandatory thing we have to accommodate, because we're also overwhelmed with digital distractions, that if it doesn't come into the flow of work, you may miss it entirely.
Right.
So there's a vendor that announced something that I called conversational micro learning, which is kind of like a conversational interface to content. It happens to be used for leadership development. But I think that's part of this this whole space is making sure people can access the content without either missing it or just avoiding to go because they're too busy.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And we already have a question that's come in from the participants, and I don't want to answer it completely right now, but I want you guys to think about it as you're answering other questions, because Marcus is asking, so many of these conversations are focused on white collar workers, and he's thinking about learning in the flow of work for frontline workers. So Brandon, I thought about you right away, and tradespeople, where their learning device might be a mobile phone, what issues come with that. So it'd be great if we address it not just for white collar, but also for those frontline workers. I know at Go One, we had clients early in the pandemic who suddenly had to pivot to training warehouse workers, within 3 days to meet compliance, and they had never done e-learning before. They didn't even have computers. So something to think about as we talk today. But Brandon, I want to talk a little bit about your books, and I like that it's plural now. So sort of, or you're almost there. So you wrote the book called Learning in the Age of Immediacy, and now you have a new one called Impact, which seems to me a playbook for L&D in the digital age. So I'd like to hear more about what the age of immediacy is, and what does that mean for the flow of work and learning, and tell us a little bit how you're addressing this in your new book, Impact.
Yeah, I mean, we're obviously seeing a confluence of really transformational shifts going on even before the pandemic, right? The pandemic kind of blew a lot of it up, but even before that, we're undergoing the largest scale job migration in the history of humanity right now, right, as the digital age is unfolding. And so everything about work is changing. And because of that, L&D is kind of on the spot, if you will, to come up with much more creative and innovative solutions as it applies to getting people information that they need kind of at that moment of need, if you will, as all the jobs are changing. And that's one thing we're not, even with the pandemic, which sort of accelerated things. I remember watching Build in June, and Satya opened with, Microsoft has gone through 2 years of digital transformation in about 2 weeks. So it's, this year has been definitely accelerated by that digital age, which really the accelerant behind that is the convergence of these technological forces, right? So all of that is driving the change and making, really bringing us a skills polarization, if you will. So it's really interesting to hear the question about frontline workers. We're really segregating into two types of workers now, the physical worker and the cognitive worker. And each one of them leverages technology in different ways. And that's part of the challenge from the L&D perspective, especially as we try to embed learning more into the flow of work. So that's kind of the focus of what I've been writing about over these two books. The most recent one is really trying to talk to L&D as a practice and how it needs to reorient for these times. But when it comes to part of these challenges about learning in the flow of work, one, I think there's three phases, and one of them is it's always been there. So the majority of us learn how to do our job where? On the job. So that's kind of the sticky first phase of learning in the flow of work. We learn by watching others, peers, colleagues, talking to our leaders, and just figuring it out. A lot of that goes on. It always has been going on. And then the second phase is that sometime in our past, L&Ds decided to bring overlays onto the existing work environment. And by that, I mean integrating and augmenting work with performance support mechanisms. So we've done that through classic job aids. We've done that through in-system help and other forms of providing what Josh mentioned earlier, the contextual help while people are doing their job. And what I think the third phase is where we're not at yet, but where we need to think about going. And I talk at length about this in the book, is what I call embedded learning, which truly embedded learning, where we, meaning L&D, we're encouraging more scalable learning, as Hegel calls it, by designing learning into the physical work environments from the ground up, as opposed to an overlay onto an existing work environment. And so this is where we'll drive optimal performance, if you think about it, if we can embed opportunities in to learn in the environment from the ground up. I think it's going to be less individual skills based as the future of work unfolds for us, definitely more teams based. So, how we connect folks in the work environment and make learning a critical component of the work they do, the sooner we can get to that, the more optimal performance we'll get. And that way learning becomes less of a transactional activity. We're trying to do a little bit of this now. The comment about frontline workers will be interesting to get to when we get around to that. But really what we've got to do is figure out, okay, workers need to collaborate and communicate with each other in teams-based work going forward, really regardless of the type of work you do, physical or cognitive. So we've got to move from overlaying to really helping to construct optimal work environments for performance.
Yeah, and another participant, Christine, mentioned that there are also healthcare workers that are at a patient's bedside and they're trying to learn too. So it's all aspects of learners.
Can I make it just a comment on that idea, and then we'll talk to Jane. One of the companies I worked with for years is Verizon, and I remember interviewing the head of learning there a long time ago, and she said, the product managers who design new products that we sell, design the learning while they're designing the product, because they know customer service reps and sales reps and people have to know how to sell these things. So that gets back to Brandon's idea that this has to go back to the beginning of sort of the design of the system or the product in the usability, which we don't get to do that in L&D. A lot of times that we just get thrown this thing and say, hey, develop a bunch of learning around it. But, right? I mean, that's kind of where the ideal.
Right.
Yeah, true. Very, very true. Okay, so Jane, speaking of technology and tools, so Microsoft has been investing in some new approaches to learning. So when we were prepping for this call, you mentioned the virtual commute, and I was fascinated by it. I'd love to hear not just about that, things that you're working with at Microsoft and what learning in the flow of work looks like there, but definitely I'd like everyone to hear more about the virtual commute.
Great. Yeah, so at Microsoft, we are thinking about learning in the flow of work, more of a learning in the flow of life and a more holistic approach. So we're really exploring the learner's ecosystem, starting from what we are calling this virtual commute. where we are really recognizing that transition into the day. Not that we want to sit through traffic, but to sit there and to reflect on what we have to do. That time, that ritual that we have, that can be so important. Inside the workday and also just between work and home. And given that we know that we don't have enough time to learn in the day, Microsoft has a lot of great tools we use, like it helps you schedule focus time. We're trying to get the analytics to also schedule learning time, very specifically, explicitly learning time, as well as wellness time. So this really holistic learning has to accomplish all of those things. And we are defining and experimenting what it means for Microsoft Teams to be a learning platform. It's a really great collaboration and communications platform. But we are really trying to crack that nut. Recently, we converted our 2-day in-person manager program for 20,000 managers to a multi-week learning experience run entirely on Teams. So take a deep breath after that. That was, we took a customer zero approach where we really evaluated all of the available tools and technologies, and we're very intentional when determining the right level of integration between them all. So we have a lot at Microsoft, a lot of great tools. But what are the right combinations that work well? And making sure that we're capturing relevant data that we can tell a true story of a learner's experience. I think the key to the success of that program was how we designed the information architecture of the experience and made sure that the content, the navigation, and the resources did not get lost in the abyss of a Microsoft Teams file folder or structure. So we really had to design for the platform, but design for how learners use the platform. But the design was also recognizable. So for our employees, they know how to use Teams, so it's familiar. But the challenge we're facing is really making it distinct, the learning distinct on Teams, so that it is branded in a way that does not get lost under the numerous channels that a learner may be in. But what we're finding is way more than quantitative data. We're finding on these threads just very different levels of development on skills like empathy and vulnerability and forgiveness, and really finding where we have gaps and where we're doing well to make sure that we can target our learning to be very specific to them. So that is a new way we're trying to capture data and tell a story of our learning in the flow of work.
Excellent. So, and Lynn is asking for more specifics, which is good timing because we're going to do a quick demo. We did a video demo. So Shannon, I'll let you, don't play it yet, but be ready.
Can I just add something on that?
Absolutely, Josh.
When we started looking, Jane, at Teams, because we have this learning platform that's designed for HR, and we thought, what are we going to stick in there? We don't want to stick the whole program in there and everything else because it's not really what design. So some of this is thinking about what part of the learning content that you've built somewhere else do you want to expose in what fashion? And I think, Caroline, I don't know if you're going to show the conversation starters that we have, but like one of the things we found was in Teams, it would be great for somebody to ask a question and get an answer, which is a pretty common interface, to do a search and find something, and actually start a conversation on a topic that relates to a learning program or a learning activity that took place somewhere else. Those were 3 very simple use cases that came to us, and it was really easy to do that in Teams. And I think one of the companies that's done a huge amount of this is Genpact. Jane, I don't know if you're familiar with them. They built an entire learning environment around Teams, and not trying to replicate what LMSs do or replicate what e-learning platforms do, but use the collaborative experience in Teams as a default. Oh, well, while you're collaborating, these are the things you're going to want to do. Find somebody who knows this and so forth. And I think that's the magic of this. And you guys are like a year or so into it. I think it's going to end up being a huge platform.
Yeah. So I want to kick off our little demo. It's only 2 minutes, but so it's a quick show of what it looks like. And I just wanted to comment that, for Go One, learning in the flow of work is content. We're a content aggregator. So we've made sure to collect the best content we can from global providers like the Bersin Academy, and make sure that they're available in LMS and LXPs and now Microsoft Teams. And, you know, making sure that learners have access to the right content at the right time at the right level. So Shannon, if you want to launch that, I'll talk through a little bit. There's no voice, there's no audio. First, you'll see, let's see, is it going? Yes. So right then you saw Josh, someone searched, you know, flow of work, and there was Josh's course that popped up. So, you know, you'll see throughout the video, getting access to content through your LMS, but within Teams. So, you know, we wanted to make it convenient so that people could access learning content from places where they frequently are. And I can't see the whole video screen right now, so I can't tell you exactly what's happening because it's tiny, but I will tell you that in there you'll see collaboration within teams of groups. So it's easy to share the content that you find and discuss it with each other. So Josh, you spoke about that earlier. So again, we're just trying to make it easier for employees and more collaborative and quick. So it is in the flow of work while you're discussing and searching and finding. And we're also really excited about our integration with Microsoft Search, which you'll see towards the end. So when you're searching for things, content will come up too right within there. Give it a few more minutes.
Well, the other thing, of course, that Microsoft is doing is all the Project Cortex indexing technology. So other documents in Microsoft are going to be able to be discoverable much easier too, which is part of the learning experience.
Right. So Josh, is this showing a little bit about what you were speaking about?
Yeah. This is a good inspiration for people.
Yeah, we didn't want to make it too complicated because it isn't. It's really simple. So, and right there's the course library and more conversation and collaboration, more content.
I think for the people, you know, I don't know who all the people are that are on the line, but if you're a learning designer or an L&D person, I think the technology is interesting and very fascinating and lots of options, but think about the audience too, of who are these people and what are they doing all day?
Yeah, no, it's exactly right. And that's it. How can we make it frictionless for everybody is exactly right. So that leads into another question, and anyone can answer this. So how does learning in the flow of work fit into a broader L&D strategy? I mean, Brandon, we talked about this a little. Is it finding new methods of delivering top-down training? Is it more mobile, more chat? You know, what does it look like?
Well, for us, we're actually trying to solve some real problems that were brought on, obviously, by the pandemic. As you can imagine, a significant number of our training happens around live aircraft. And the airline doesn't offer us up aircraft that we can use for training. So, you know, we don't have a hangar by our L&D function to store one in. So we have to do a lot of training around the physical aircraft. And of course, COVID brought a whole set of challenges to that, as you can imagine. But even before that, when you think about it, we stress safety, right? So safety is a key component of all of our training that we do for our frontline folks that work around the aircraft. And it's safety behaviors that are critical. And they're engaging quite frankly, in repeated kind of automated behavior over and over. Some of the same tasks just have to happen over and over. So we were looking for ways to drive safety as a part of, you know, the work, obviously, and how do we reinforce key safety concepts, right? We can't have devices out around the aircraft, so you can't pause and do something on a device, right? So part of what we're trying to do, other than our experiential training that we leverage VR for, so we do leverage virtual reality and immersive simulations for some of the training we do. But for the real on-the-job training, we get around the aircraft, usually with the trainer, and we go through it. Of course, with COVID, we had to get real creative using video and stuff like that from a distance. But for the safety component, we're looking at nudging. And so how do we nudge in small, short, at the most 2-minute kind of what we call nudges to reinforce key concepts right before or right after people go into the work stream, right into the workflow, if you will. And so we're sort of, with that, we're on the edge of the work. We're having people engage in an activity that will reinforce a key concept before they go out onto the ramp and work on the plane. The next iteration of that, though, is we want to put a device on their body that will nudge them through haptics or some kind of prompt on their physical self if they're getting into areas where they shouldn't be. For example, if you get too close to the engine, right, to prevent engine ingestion, things like that. So we're trying to get creative on how we can bring nudging into the flow of work in a more hazardous environment versus, you know, a typical work environment in a cubicle and stuff like that. So it's a little bit more challenging for us, but OJT, on the job training, that type of work is the majority of what we do. We don't actually do a lot of e-learning, and we do some live classroom before we go into the operation, but a lot of our training is in the operation, as you can imagine. And so we did move to live virtual quite significantly using platforms such as Teams, and putting folks on a plane, for example, with the Teams app, you know, to be showing video to people who are remote as well. So we've gotten scrappy and creative around what the pandemic has wrought. But once that is alleviated, we will be back in there trying to figure out how we, continue with things like those nudges and that kind of stuff.
And Brandon and Jane, so it's come up a few times in the chat. How are you capturing that learning is taking place, especially now that so much of it is online?
Well, so we obviously have regulatory oversight for a lot of the training we do. Our training, there's a certain type of our training that has to be stored. Someone's completion of it has to be stored, because when they log into a system every day to work, it literally checks the LMS to make sure that they are qualified to do the job before they're allowed access to the system. So we're really looking at, I mean, obviously we have to do that through a learning management system, which the FAA has oversight on. So we have that component of a lot of our operational training where it has to be connected to, the data has to be stored in the LMS. The nudging system that we're working on will reinforce what they're qualified to do. So it's a less formal kind of intervention, if you will, but it's tracked as well. We're tracking that as well. So we have to track whether people are qualified to do the job. And we do that, and that means we'll always have an LMS. But again, the LMS is basically a database. We can get various nodes to report to it based on what we're doing.
Yeah, Jane, anything you can share about how you're capturing learning?
Yeah, so right now we're exploring capturing behavior change is a big one for us. And so in a lot of our virtual programs, we're having learners document kind of commitments they're making as a result of learning, or goals or insights, and we're actually having it scheduled to come back to them in 3 months or in 6 months, where they can evaluate how they're doing. So it also can trigger, we can see, you know, are most of these people making their commitments, or what's blocking their commitments. So it's used for us to collect the data, but also for them to kind of reflect and take a step back. You know, I took this training or I took this learning, and now did I even do anything? Did I forget about it? Or where am I at in that journey? So that's actually been an exciting way to track, is behavior change and habit change. Yeah. I think is hard to capture sometimes.
And Josh, so, you know, given the pandemic and global restrictions and, you know, learning is now online, we're not traveling, we can't be in person. So what are you seeing in terms of additional challenges, but also opportunities with learning in the flow of work?
Well, I mean, everybody's spending more time on front of their computers, so there's more consumption, for sure. Everybody tells me that they're getting a lot more activity of their learning.
At Go One, our consumption is very high.
Yeah, and so that's driving opportunity for you guys to put more stuff online into Teams or into whatever the location is where people are working. That's number one. Number two is there's a lot of interest and sensitivity to well-being, patience, empathy with family issues. So, you build a long corporate training program that's your traditional 4 hours of we're going to teach it. Yeah, nobody's going to they're not going to do it right now. So
They may need
everybody's
mindfulness training right now.
yeah, I mean, I might go to a yoga class for 45 minutes, but I'm not going to go through an ERP class for 2 hours.
Headspace app. That's available on Microsoft Teams.
Yeah.
Coming soon.
So there's that. So also live learning is very powerful right now. I mean, these Zoom meetings are unbelievable. I'm on Zoom meetings all day, as a lot of you are, and they're very useful. It used to be you got to get on a plane, go to the airport, da, 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 da. Now you're just there. So face-to-face learning is back. In fact, it's probably more, we're probably doing more instructor-led than we did in years, because we can get hold of people so quickly, as well as open group discussions, town halls, things like that. I'm on lots and lots of those. And then I think this tech, also virtual reality is huge. I mean, I know you guys are into it in Microsoft and other areas. I know you guys do it at Delta. You can now do the simulation of a live experience or a physical activity in VR very, very cost effectively. One company told me all the money they were spending on their corporate university for people flying into, wherever, Crotonville or whatever, and having meetings. Oh, we just bought some VR tools and some headsets, and we're doing some pretty cool stuff at half the price. That's new from the pandemic. And then I think Microsoft, you guys are going to be sort of disrupting the market piece by piece as you add more focus on this, because I mean, we all use Microsoft products, in many ways. And so LinkedIn Learning will probably start appearing in places, I have to imagine. Smaller and smaller videos. One more thing I just want to mention is this idea of conversational micro learning. I mean, that's a word I came up with when I was watching what somebody else was doing. Conversations are an increasingly powerful way to interact with technology. We use it on our chat, we use it in social networking, and it's easy. And so if your learning is integrated in a chat type of interface, you're probably going to reach people more frequently than sending them to a video to watch that they may or may not have time. So that's another big thing I think that's the pandemic is teaching us. And a lot of the vendors are building really nice tools for conversational, curated and more managed conversational activities.
I'm definitely seeing that people have become more independent with their learning as well too. When you think about it, when you're in an office space, you can lean across the table and ask a question. I mean, even simple things like Excel course training consumption has gone up at Go1, and that's because you're not sitting next to your Excel buddy anymore who can show you a secret tip for pivot tables. So it's really interesting to see how people are becoming more self-sufficient with learning as well. They have to. They may have to figure out something immediately, and they need to have the access to the tool with which to do it.
Can I make one more point, just
Please.
for a sec? I think there's a tendency for all of us to get so excited about the tech that we think throwing a lot of things out there is better. And I think we just have to be a little bit careful with that. It may make you feel good that a lot of people are clicking on a lot of things, but we don't know if they're learning anything. So I do think there's a refocus on what I call capabilities, which is, as an L&D professional, the reason you're here, the reason we're here is to understand what those capabilities are and figure them out, and then make sure everybody has access to material to develop those capabilities. And that might mean finding the person to talk to, not just taking the course or having a developmental assignment. For example, in the HR stuff we're doing, we have a lot of people going through this capability assessment. The number one thing they want is a mentor. They don't want courses. They want somebody to talk to. They want the right person to talk to. So make sure you don't forget about that in this strategy.
No, I definitely, and another thing I was going to add too is I think one of the worst things you can do is throw 60,000 courses at someone. I mean, we're pretty specific at Go1 in that while we do grant access to, you could have 60,000 courses, we'd much rather help you find the 50 or the 100 that are most relevant to what you need and can help your capabilities change. So, don't just start piling on courses and content and tools and bells and whistles. Everyone will get overwhelmed and it's just not effective. So I think you do have to make sure that you are specific in what your goals are. And
Yeah, there was a question about that, kind of the overwhelming, all these, ways to platforms to go to. And one thing to just think about is, back to that, embedding it into a true culture of learning means that learning is just a part of the work itself, and it can flow seamlessly through the environment. And part of what we need to do as learning designers is really understand deeply how the work gets done.
Mhm.
We may think we know. If we spend a couple of days, we may think we know how it gets done. But I can pretty much guarantee a lot of what we're training on does not happen in the typical day. There's a lot of
Wow,
other
I've
things
been so impressed with you, Brandon, in your roles. I mean, both at Home Depot and Delta, I've known you at both. And you'll throw on an orange apron and go head to the store, and that's really important as L&D is learning the
Yeah.
importance of what they need to learn and what the issues are. You said someone was coming up to you asking questions and you didn't know how to answer them. You needed a tool.
I mean, there are some areas where it's like, I was in Chicago once helping in the electrical aisle, and then at one point I'm like, wait a minute, I don't know all of the codes here in Chicago. I don't want to burn someone's house down.
Right.
But the point is, we need to understand how. There's this thing Hegel talks about, and he mentions it's called exception handling. 80%, his theory is 80% of what a worker, especially a frontline worker, deals with day to day is not anything we train them on. And so, like, part of the challenge is we need to understand all of those dynamics that unfold during a workday. This is where multiple nodes, if you will, of where learning can occur. And if you set up the environment to motivate people to learn more, then that's where you're going to break down a lot of that exception handling problem, right? Because we sit in our cubes wherever we're at, and we're just developing the training according to a procedure or a standard operating model, right?
Right.
But when you go out there, like I spent a day as a gate agent, I've done that before, and everything was going smoothly until customers started actually speaking to me. And then I'm like, oh, okay, now I've got to do both of these things. So I realized how hard the job is. So I think it's design thinking in some ways. You have to have empathy for what the workforce goes through, as well. And understand that every worker at every level now is interacting with technology somehow to get their job done. Like, we have this feature in our app, which our customers love, where it'll notify you when your bag is loaded on the plane, and it'll notify you when your bag is taken off the plane and let you know kind of where it is, right, at all times. The technology infrastructure required for that to happen is quite massive, right? Because we're literally scanning millions of bags a day, and you can't miss a bag. Every bag has to be scanned, and at some point a human has to scan that. So although we have all this technology to make it happen, human intervention is required, and we have to make sure that we have affordance for that human component in the workflow.
Yeah, and I just wanted to add, I would love to be able to go in and put an apron on and learn from my learners directly. But in practicality, a realistic Jane, I'm unable to do that for a lot of my roles. So what we've been starting to implement is to have a subject matter expert, a business expert, and a learning expert on all of our projects, so that that voice is heard, so that they can put on the apron and explain it to me, even though I can't see them do it. And that's been a scalable way to at least invite more of the learner perspective rather than just the subject matter expert. So, but I love the apron. I would do it if I could, but.
You fall off the ladder
That's
or something.
great. I'm not sure that Brandon helped the person find the right leaf blower, but he gave it a try.
Yeah. Oh, I can sell a mean chainsaw though, I'll tell you.
So maybe Josh, I'll throw this one at you. So someone commented earlier that, can we not just focus on white collar workers, and frontline workers are important too. So is learning in the flow of work capable for all kinds of organizations? Do you need to have an advanced L&D function to do it? Or, can anyone do it? And also, are there organizations that shouldn't look at learning in this way?
Well, yeah, I mean, if you're not a super big company, you don't have a big fancy L&D department, you can buy content in your domain, nursing, sales, support, whatever it is, safety, compliance, diversity, etc. And you can make it available to people. And if you get a good content provider, and you guys obviously have access to all that content, it can be pretty useful and pretty in the flow of work for those people if you don't give them a difficult experience to find it. But the other part of this I was just going to mention, listening to you guys, is this idea of a learning circle or a learning conversation, I don't know. I used to work at McDonald's years ago. As much as they teach you how to do something, sometimes you just have to ask somebody a question. Hey, how'd you do this? Has anybody had this problem before? Oh, yeah, I solved that. Those are really, really powerful things. That's why mentoring came up as the #1 demand in our academy. It wasn't that they want to have a 4-hour conversation with a mentor. They just want to have somebody to talk to about the thing they're working on. So that's free. You don't have to, you don't need to be super high-end content.
You have that already.
That. So don't forget about that.
Yeah, that's really, really crucial. So I'm looking to see, did I miss any questions?
While you're looking, let me just add to that, to what Josh is saying, because in the short run, as technology continues to unfold, and part of the challenge we're faced with is businesses are significantly, they're significantly investing in technology, integrating more technology. Work is going to get a lot more complex in the short term. It's not necessarily going to get easier. So those mentors and even coaches to a certain degree are really going to be a valuable asset for you to unleash within your organization, because I'll be totally transparent here. Our education system is not really preparing folks to come into these complex work environments where, and the other thing is the CEO problem we have is too many CEOs are not investing enough in the learning function to keep it up to parity with the way they're investing in technology. So we've got a massive skills gap on our hands. It is really a huge schism that we're facing, and L&D is going to be caught in the crosshairs of that. So all of these available resources you have within the enterprise to mentor and coach that is learning in the flow of work as well. To Josh's point, it's not just technology. Sometimes it's those people that really know how to get things done.
Yeah, and let me make a comment on that one, you guys. One of the guys I've met over the years is Edgar Schein, who's a famous professor in culture. And I remember I was talking to him once, and I asked him, you've studied all these companies and the cultures failed. What is the thing that you remember among all of them? And he said, there's really only one thing that makes companies successful: people helping each other. And I thought, wow, that's a nice thing to say, kind of goofy. Oh, wait a minute, it's a little more profound than that. It actually means that people will stop what they're doing and help somebody else. And that's actually a fairly complicated idea that may or may not happen at a given company. So I think learning culture and facilitating and rewarding people for sharing what they know and telling stories and answering questions is maybe one of the most important tools we have. If Teams helps, great, which I think it does. But I think that's a really important part of our job in L&D, is making sure that's happening and pointing out when it's not happening.
Actually, Josh,
this might be a conversation for another time, but I just want to, what I'm finding difficult is helping people unlearn. Unlearning things seems to be a part of the L&D world that is challenging. We're trying to help them learn, but first, before we can do that, we have to unlearn. So that seems to be a challenge that we're all facing, but I just want to call that out.
Yeah, I think that's so true. And Deanna just commented too, one of our strongest learning tools presently are communities of practice, basic learning conversation at varying levels of expertise. And I think that's so true. So thank you, Josh, for adding that. And that leads us to the 45-minute mark. So I think it's a good place to stop. I want to thank Josh and Jane and Brandon for joining us today, and for all of the participants' questions and collaboration. We will be sending out a link to this recording, and I will make sure we include a link to the demo, as some of you has asked for that as well. So thanks, and have a really great day.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Yeah.